Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah, wa ala alihi wa sahbihi, wa man wala. Can everyone hear me okay? In the back? In the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate, may the peace and blessings of God be upon the Prophet Muhammad and upon all of the other rightly guided prophets and messengers sent to humankind. It's an honor to be here. I'm very happy to come back again to Leeds. I've been here before, and its sister city. Can you say that, Bradford? It seemed like we didn't ever leave the city. I was noticing on the way that your idea of a carpool lane, when I think of a carpool lane, I think of a 4 or 5 lane highway that you all call here motorways in the United States, where the carpool lane is one of the lanes to the left. That I've never seen on a 2-lane, what we would call like a small road, a carpool lane. But alhamdulillah, it's nice to be here, and I'm very happy to see that this is something that is being done again at Leeds University, these series of lectures for Islamic Awareness Week. Excuse me. And I think that as time goes on, that these types of meetings, even though we have a small number of people here together in this room, become more and more important. And I wish that we had a larger segment from the greater population that doesn't necessarily follow the deen of Islam, because I welcome any opportunity to interact and to discuss things, especially with other faith-based communities, believing in the fact that in the upcoming years, for Muslims in the UK in particular, and Muslims in the European part of that are part of the European Union, Western Europe, and part of the European Union in general, and even beyond that, that even across the Atlantic into where I'm from, that this is becoming increasingly important. Because I think that a lot of the internal fighting, so to speak, whether it be Muslims versus Muslims and competing ideologies and so forth, or whether it be between Muslims and those of other faith, that have other faiths, or even for that matter, people that don't necessarily believe in anything related to a divinely inspired religion, a deen Samawi, that if you look at what we're facing as humanity, I think the metaphor that the Prophet Muhammad gave, may the peace and blessings of God be upon him, is a very apt metaphor. And the metaphor that he described the human condition as 2 different parties being on a ship. And as this ship has set sail and is crossing a landmass, a body of water rather, that those at the top had free access to water, but they neglected those at the bottom, who also wanted water, and so they started to dig a hole in the bottom of the ship in order for them to get water. Now, that our Prophet went on to say that if those at top don't take care of the ones on bottom, that the entire ship is going to sink. And what we're realizing now, in a number of different realms, whether it be related to theoretical physics, whether it be related to the environment, whether it even be related to now in the globalized world in which we all live, that we're starting to realize the interconnectivity and interdependence of everything. And just as we see that when the sandstorms of North Africa blow dust, such that there's important elements that the jungles of the Amazon are fertilized because of these sandstorms that take place in the Saharan Desert, this being one particular example. And thus we're starting to realize increasingly that everything is interdependent, and that we are all starting to realize increasingly that we all have a responsibility that extends beyond our own selves. Now, the nature of the human being is such that it's very difficult for people to see beyond their own selves, especially when you add into the equation privilege. And being from one of the most privileged places on the face of this earth, i.e. the United States of America, I think it's very interesting and food for thought to think the country that I come from, which is probably a great critique of the British and the Europeans in general of America, is that I come from a country that has a consumer mentality. And that anywhere from the broad spectrum of 25 to 40% of the overall resources that the world has to offer are consumed by the population of my country, which is only 5% of the overall population of the world. And that, to me, is a gross imbalance and something worthy of thinking about. And that I think it's also a great, in many ways, a great proof of the lack of consciousness of this interdependence about which I'm speaking. And that as these barriers come down worldwide, and that now we see, as some would say, that the world, so to speak, is flat. That if you look at globalism and the 3 stages of globalism, this is one way of looking at it, nothing definitive. This is the insight of one individual named Thomas Friedman, that he said the first stage of globalism was somewhere around 1492, which incidentally was the same year that the Spanish Inquisition began. It was the same year that also Christopher Columbus sailed looking for what he thought was India, but I wouldn't use the word discover, because how could you discover something that was already there? That if you ask the natives of North and South America, they wouldn't say that it was discovered, that it was already there. Right? He happened to find it himself, and so if you use discover in that sense, if he didn't know that it existed, that's fine. However, that this stage from approximately 1492 to maybe 1800, that as that they found different routes around Cape Horn and the southern peninsula of Africa, and that the travels of the seas became easier and easier, and that they found alternative routes, that they didn't rely anymore on the traditional trade routes and the Silk Route that the Muslims were at the forefront of for numerous centuries, about 8 centuries, and even before that. A lot of what people don't realize was the placement of Arab communities even in the years before Christianity was founded, that there were Arabs living in multiple places in the world, in the east coast of Africa, as well as in India and other places as well, which is one of the reasons why when Islam spread to India, in the north, it was very different the way that it spread in the south. And it's also why that if you look at a lot of the goods that eventually were reaching Europe in the Middle Ages, that they were all coming through, the heartland of the Muslim world. And that's a whole topic in and of itself. But this stage of 1492 until, let's say, about 1800 was what this particular individual delineates as the first stage of globalism. And he said that it turned the large world into a medium-sized world. And then he said this was primarily done on the hands of the nation-state, meaning this was the primary catalyst for the shrinking, so to speak, of the world. And then he said from about 1800 until the year, he said 2000, that we find the world shrinking from medium-sized to small. And he said that this was primarily done on the hands of the nation-state, although multinational corporations rather, but also continually that the nation-states also had something to do with that. And this is related to the Industrial Revolution, that it's really interesting to look at the time difference between the Agricultural Revolution and the Industrial Revolution. And if you relate this to rate of change, that between the Agricultural Revolution and the Industrial Revolution is about 8,000 years. But if you look at the time span between one of the other catalysts of change, between the Industrial Revolution, let's say the invention of electricity, which then revolutionized things even more, that you're looking at a period of 120 years about. And that this incredible changes that took place in these times is really something worth thinking about, because we live in a time where things are changing so quickly. Just when you think that you understand something, the next day something happens and you're scurrying around trying to think about what you're going to do next. Who would ever have thought what just happened in Tunisia was going to happen? Who would ever have thought what just happened in Egypt was going to happen? And who knows what's going to happen tomorrow? That we now have protests in Libya, we now have protests in Bahrain, and we've had protests as well in Yemen, and there was protests in Jordan, and who knows where else there's going to be protests. Who would have thought that that would have happened in the way that it happened? So that this second stage turned the globe and the world community from medium-sized to small. And it was primarily done on the hands of the multinational corporation as a result of the Industrial Revolution, which for the first time created the opportunity for there to be consumer tendencies. There was always civilizations that indulged more than others. However, to be able to have cheap goods and to be able to have those goods reach places in the earth that they never were able to reach before is significant in world history. Finally, he delineates the third stage, beginning with the PC, the personal computer, and everything that follows that internet access and so forth, which turned the world from small into tiny. And so now that you have many corporations you call in because your internet provider is, there's something wrong, and that you're talking to someone in India who speaks English, and that he works at the same time for Comcast or AT&T or another one of these companies. Now, that might not seem so far-fetched for you living here in England and the history between England and India in the past, but for someone from that lives on the other side of the world, that's something to think about. And that the personal computer sharing software that is similar, such that someone creating a document in the East can send that document to someone in the West and then work together on a project. This is now books being written about the whole Wikipedia effect, and that collaboration and the ability to collaborate, and now the modern means of communication facilitating this collaboration, and the great things that can come from that, and many times in the good side of the scale and other times the not so good side of the scale. And that if you look at now our stage that we're in now, that we're in this last stage that has turned the world into something tiny. Now what the future holds, I don't know. I was just reading an article on the plane flying here to England that was an article, to me, it was a bit scary to think, to know about what some people are thinking of. I don't know, have any of you heard of the Singularity Movement? That this Singularity Movement, so to speak, is this entire movement in the United States. I think they're based somewhere in the South, maybe in Texas. And they have their own university, and that it was started by some of the key people in some of the largest corporations in the United States, like Google and others. And they've had some very famous CEOs take over at various times for their institute or organization, or whatever it is. And basically what their whole premise is that they believe that the computers are evolving so fast that as of right now, the fastest computer is just behind the speed of a rat's brain. But they project by the year 2025 that we'll almost have computers that have a power that are as powerful as the human brain. And they theorize that by the year 245, that potentially, and it will probably get into some details, I don't fully understand exactly how, and I think it's kind of difficult to think because this is so abstract and intangible, that they say that the computers will become so powerful in having created this artificial intelligence that will, one, then affect the human being, make that human being change, possibly evolve into something else other than what we know the human being to be, and maybe something else happens entirely. But this whole idea of this realm, this singularity, where that the whole principles of physics as we know it, that no longer functions. And that meaning that there's a whole new level of reality. Now, that you might say that it's kind of a marginal type of movement. Many people haven't even ever heard of that. But you'd be surprised at how many of the most important worldwide institutes and individuals that are taking part in at least lending an ear to this type of thinking. That my point is, in all of this discussion, is that it's very important for us to kind of step back and to kind of understand, at least generally, where we are and how we got where we are. And then to kind of look forward and to start lending an ear to other people's visions about what the future has in store for humankind. And that then, if we can have this ability to do that, then we can assess our own situation. And we can look into our own situations and see what is it that we can do now in relation to all of this. And this, as a backdrop, is how I wanted to approach this discussion tonight. I've been given a particular topic, and I will try to stay on it. I don't know if I will be able to. But I have a tendency to ramble and take a lot of tangents. However, that it might seem that this particular topic is, has nothing to do with everything that I just mentioned. But I would contend that it has everything to do with what I just mentioned. And this whole topic of contentment and it being the gift of the believer and what the believer possesses. And what I would say to that is that faith-based communities have a worldview related to an eschatological worldview related to that things happen at the end. Meaning that we have a tendency, whether we be Muslim or Christian or Jewish or Hindu or Buddhist, to see things in cycles. And I think that there's a lot of wisdom in seeing things in cycles. And by teaching yourself and training yourself to see things in cycles, that you'll have an ability then to be able to have a holistic understanding of the way things work. That if you're so much caught up in the moment that you can't understand, for instance, the whole concept of the rise and fall of civilizations, that what you will find is that you yourself won't be immune to those very things that cause the rise and respective fall of different civilizations. And that it is through this type of knowledge that will engender in the human being the wisdom to know what it is that they can do in that particular moment. And so I really enjoy these type of opportunities to come together where we could start to discuss these different issues that face us as human beings. And I really want to focus on that. And that there is a human element that we all share. The fact that we share this planet, first and foremost, and we share the fact that we've been given life. If someone would ask you right now, and I had one of my teachers say to me that he had a class on critical thinking, and they asked the class that, what does a frog have in common with a spaceship? And most people think, like, nothing. What on earth would a frog have in common with a spaceship? Well, you could actually, if you've thought about these things before, that mention a long list of things that a frog has in common with a spaceship. A spaceship has a color, frogs have a color, frogs move, spaceships move, that spaceships take up space, frogs take up space, and on and on and on. You could have a whole bunch of, mention a whole long list of similarities for things that are apparently completely disparate and have nothing in common whatsoever. And I think this is really the overall challenge that faces all of us as the world continues to shrink and shrink and shrink, is to overcome a lot of the barriers of ignorance and many of the other inhibiting factors that are preventing us from really having a true sense of conviviality. And I say this as someone who has literally a foot in the East and the West. I was born in the heartland of the United States of America, in Kansas City, Missouri. And I also spent about 10 years between Mauritania, Syria, and Yemen. And I've traveled widely through the Muslim world, and I've been to many Muslim countries from east to west. And I've been privileged to have a perspective from within, knowing very intimately many Muslim families from the so-called East, and learning the way they view things, and understanding some of their criticisms, and at the same time, that everyone else in my family is of a different faith than I am. And I see them all the time, learn their perspectives, as well as everyone else that I used to know before I went on this journey overseas. And I've come to certain conclusions based upon that I really truly believe that there's certain inhibiting factors, and the greatest of them is ignorance. And that if we can overcome this ignorance about the so-called other, and learn to not glance outwardly at the other and kind of have our own oriental view of the other, and to come to learn the other, so to speak, from within, and to let them self-define themselves and to accept them accordingly. That this is in my belief, is the greatest obstacle of all that I see on both sides. That whether they be Muslims that are living in the East, or whether they be non-Muslims that are living in the West, that say blanket statements and create these false dichotomies and a black and white way of viewing the world, which is, in my view, untenable. That especially if you've lived on both sides. And one of the great things that really was a breakthrough for my father when he came to visit me in Yemen, and he was just walking down the street. He's a photographer, and this is a very small city in southern Arabia. Maybe has 100,000 population, but it seems like more of a village. And very simple living, mud brick houses, dusty, unpaved streets. And he was walking down the street and taking some pictures, very Western in his look, Western clothes, so forth. And this little Yemeni man that has dark skin comes out of his house. And, he looks probably somewhat similar to, those 17 individuals that had something to do with 9/11. And he starts talking to my dad. And my dad, doesn't really know what to do. He doesn't speak Arabic. Only word he knows is Abu Yahya, the father of Yahya, which is my name. And daughter al-Mustafa, which was the school. So he just said, Abu Yahya, daughter al-Mustafa. And he points to the school. He says, ah. So he knew. So he invites my father in. And they sit down, and they're speaking back and forth, no communication, a little bit of sign language. It doesn't really work, but he serves my father tea. And my dad comes back in the morning after this little journey outside, and he was literally flabbergasted. For him, that it just shattered everything that he thought about these native people. All of these preconceived notions that had been pumped into his mind about the way that this dark-skinned, bearded Muslim would think about America and Americans, that it was completely shattered. And that impacted him more than anything else, probably. That one of the greatest things that impacted him during his entire trip. And this is something very small and insignificant, you would think. But I think that it is really the human side of things that is so important to get down to the heart of the human side. Every single human being that has things in common. And that the problem then is this demonization. And that when we look at these other things that people have in common, and you see the human side of people, that no longer can you commit atrocities for those people, against those people. And that if you look at what's happening now, and I'll speak first and foremost about my own country, that in the midterm elections in 2000, that just passed, I mean, we have midterm elections, which is related to the Congress and the Senate, your House of Commons, House of Lords, and that there was a lot of Islamophobic rhetoric, where people openly were reviling Islam in order to get elected to a political position. And if you saw some of these commercials, that they were completely and totally ridiculous. And that it was very interesting to look at that and to see exactly what was taking place, because there were several organizations, many of them that are funded in the millions, that their sole purpose for existence is to create a sense of fear in the American public about Islam in its relation to the overall society. And pushing, again, which I believe to be a false dichotomy, that there is no place for the Islamic identity in the American identity. And really pushing this fact that Islam is inherently against American ideals. And I personally think that is extremely dangerous. And there is a great man named Chris Hedges, who's still alive, who was a war correspondent for the New York Times for 30 years. And he covered many of the great wars of the past 3 decades. And when he came back to the United States after this long stint overseas, he said that he noticed that combined with the neoconservatives in government with the evangelical Christians that are on the far right, and I'm just mentioning this and I'm not poking at anyone's particular faith, this is what he said, that he noticed that a situation was being created now against Muslims that in every war that he covered was being created with other people. And that he has this article titled The War on Language, where he talks about the use of language, and especially as it pertains to reactionary language, and as it's used in this sense, what he's referring to before a war, and the type of terms that are used, and the way expressions that are used to convey certain meanings. And that this is a very serious thing that people have to look into. That if they truly care about these principles about which we're discussing. And I think that this is a challenge to people from different backgrounds, that to look at the so-called other and allow for the other to be self-defined. And that what we'll realize is that some of the narrow, constrictive understandings of the way globalism manifested in our time, that it could have been much broader. It didn't have to turn into some monolithic culture that really erased microcultures and created this great monoculture that encompasses everyone. And, oh wow, I haven't even gotten into what I want to talk about yet. We only have 2 minutes? Huh? That was all preface stuff. Mashallah, well, maybe I got to the heart of what I need to say. I was supposed to be talking about contentment, because I was going to provide this self-definition about which I'm speaking. I was hoping to get to that eventually. So this was all preliminary stuff, kind of making the way up to that. And what I would have to say is that this is something I believe fully, and I'll just end on this note, is that I think and I believe Islam is a dynamic religion. And I believe that Islam has the greatest things to offer the world in which we live now. And I think that one of these great things that Islam can offer the world is how to live. And that living and being a human being in tune with the natural disposition and correctly interacting with everything in the cosmos on your own personal, individual level with society and the greater cosmos. In other words, understanding the implications of our custodianship or our vicegerency on this earth. That this is, many of these principles which we need are universal, that they're shared by people of other faiths as well. and that Islam, I think, has the ability to work with other traditions for these ideals, for the things that we're all facing as humanity. And that one of these greatest things of all are related to these elements of how to live. And I think that many people now are living very empty lives because they've lost a deep purpose of what this is all about. That if we evolve from apes and that we believe the postmodernists in that everything is relative and there's no way for you truly to know and you can't be certain about anything, then what is it, this leads to utter narcissism and complete intellectual nihilism, where that if there's no basis for anything that you do and there's no purpose for anything, that creates a deep void in the human being. And that is the primary reason that will lead the human being then to act in all these ways that we've been speaking, in ways that will never lead to a sense of fulfillment. And I think that this void that needs to be fulfilled, there's certain ways to fulfill it. And that one of the great ways to fulfill it, getting 0 minutes left? 10 more minutes. So now I'm starting to close and now I gotta rewind. All right, do we have a Q&A? No Q&A? Okay, so let me just close and we'll just take a quick Q&A. One of these is related to these inner stations, and this is really what I wanted to talk about tonight, is the Islamic perspective on the inner aspect of the human being. Because that many people don't associate spirituality with Islam, many people don't associate love with Islam. And that if you look at the traditional texts that the communities of Muslims have produced over centuries, is that you will find an enormous amount of detail about the inner life. In other words, the life of the heart. And that when we discuss things like contentment, that we have to then discuss the heart. And we have to put the heart in relation to the physical body. And then we have to understand that man, here meaning in the universal sense, humankind, in relation to God as well as the cosmos. But one of the primary ways that we do this, is to understand the heart and the place of the heart. And that this is the center of the human being. And that we have a very detailed description of these different, what are called maqamat al-yaqeen, the stations of certainty, where the different states that the heart goes through, that when it is constantly fluctuating and oscillating between these different experiences and these different situations that one finds himself in, is that they respond in a particular way. And that when we talk about contentment, this is one of the most beautiful, because it is understanding the secrets of contentment that we can get out of what is termed in the Western sense the problem of evil, which is one of the great things that's turned people away from belief in God altogether. And it is understanding these different stations, and each one being a prerequisite for the other, such that the first 7 are repentance, patience, gratitude, fear, hope, renunciation, reliance upon God, and then it leads to the 8th, which is love. And then all 8 of those are prerequisites, and when those become a reality in the human being, then it leads to contentment. And contentment is the highest and greatest station of all. But you can't have true contentment from the heart. And we're not talking about, in this sense, only contentment with your physical lot in terms of that the amount of money that you make from your business, or that the house in which you live, the food that you eat, the clothes that you wear. That's part of it. That's more qana'ah. In this sense, I'm talking about rida, that this other type of contentment in a religious sense. And that is a fruit of love. And that when someone comes to understand, and at least from an Islamic perspective, that we don't have a problem with the problem of evil, and that this has never been mentioned in Islamic texts. And the reason is because that we understand that God has both attributes of beauty as well as attributes of rigor. And that we understand in our metaphysical view of the universe that everything that happens in creation is a manifestation of the attributes of God. There's the essence of God, there's His names and His attributes, and then we have the acts of God. And that everything that we see happening around us, right, are ultimately acts of God. That we believe that God creates everything in the moment, that He didn't just create creation and set it rolling and then it's disconnected from it. No, He creates every act, even the movement of my hand right now. And that the fact that we understand that there's attributes of beauty, just as there's attributes of majesty, that then we have in this theophany of these manifestations of these different names and attributes, different meanings behind every single act that happens, such that when we talk about good and evil, and even using the term the problem of evil, that is only related to human beings and human volition. That as for an act of God, that good and evil is not related to that act. It is a manifestation of one of His names and attributes. And in that sense, that everything that manifests is ultimately good. Now, that what you do in this particular way of thinking is to teach yourself to learn a dual way of looking at things at the same time. And this is something that the heart has the capacity to do. Is that just as something happens to you outwardly, and let's say that you're diagnosed with cancer, that is a situation that if you're of faith, if you have faith and you're a believer, that you see that being from God. And then that while accepting that as being from God, that doesn't negate before that trying to stay healthy and to have x-rays on a yearly basis to make and do tests to make sure that you don't have cancer. Nor does it negate after that actually dealing with that situation and that going through an operation, taking radiation, or if you have to chemotherapy and all the pills that you have to take for a long time after that. It doesn't negate that either. That simultaneously, while seeing something being from God, that then you interact with that particular thing accordingly. And that it is through understanding this other side of things that it's necessary for it to be there in order for the human being to maintain that balance, to be able to interact. And I would say this just as much to a Muslim who believes in Allah and His Messenger as I would say even to a non-Muslim, or whatever that is that they might believe. Because Muslims themselves, that especially ones that many of us are reading about in the newspapers, that this is one of the greatest problems that they are having, is this inability to see this dual nature of looking at things. And this is extremely, extremely important. And that there's one scholar, Zaytuna ibn Abdus, who has a book that he titled The 17 Benefits of Tribulation. And he talks about tribulation, and he goes through one by one, mentioning each benefit of tribulation. 17 benefits. Another recent scholar, Sheikh Keller, also wrote an article about this topic because this is something that we hear about constantly. So that if you look at things from a different perspective, what might only be considered to be evil, and if you look at it from a narrow perspective, you might be able to perceive a wisdom behind that particular act or that particular, from the human perspective, evil. And this all gets back to this whole topic of contentment. And that ultimately, that when someone reaches the station of love and sees things happening ultimately from their beloved, how could you be anything else but content? Because you realize what is behind everything from the degree is ultimately for your own benefit. I wish we had more time. I wanted to expand. I'm just kind of throwing this out here and leaving these thoughts. But I would just like to close by saying, I really thank everyone who came out especially from the non-Muslim community. And I really respect the fact that you're going out on a limb and taking the time to be able to hear from a speaker. Your time is very precious. And I really believe this is important. And I hope that here in Leeds and in Bradford and in northern England and other parts of England and throughout the world, that we can really at least attempt and try to bring a voice of reason. Because if you haven't yet noticed, there's a lot of chaos out there. And that I see a lot of craziness on both sides. And I think that we have an obligation as human beings that are all part of this world to take part in that and to engender, a sense of healing and mercy and pour water on the fire instead of kerosene. Because that, especially when it gets down to a personal level, that when you have families and friends that are involved and that are subjected to some of the other side of things that other people aren't considering, when it becomes personal, then all of a sudden people wake up. And my wife is from Afghanistan, and I've been to Afghanistan in 2005, not too long after the war that took place. And to see a war-torn city and country like Afghanistan, in particular the capital, Kabul, and to walk down the streets and see open sewage, and see numerous people, walking without a leg or without an arm, and bullet holes all over, sprayed the walls, and literally you see houses still collapsed from being damaged by rockets, and even my wife's house that she was raised in when she was young, the kitchen is just filled with black smoke from remnants of rockets and fire. That, this is something only someone there's something wrong with him would ever want that for anyone. And again, this is something we need to be conscious human beings and to participate in that which is going to benefit humanity as a whole. So those are just a few thoughts that I wanted to share. And thank you again. May Allah Ta'ala bless all of you. Sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Alhamdulillah.
Leeds University Islamic Society, I'd like to thank Shaykh for gracing us with his presence and for blessing us with his wise words. I'm sure that there is much to benefit and reflect on. And I also pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless us with his presence again very soon, his blessed sohbah again very soon. I apologize that we had to cut the talk short because Shaykh has to be at an event in Bradford, inshallah. It is our last talk of Discover Islam Week, and we hope that you have enjoyed all the talks, have visited the marquee, and have all